There are cases in Watson's casebook that never reached the public, not for want of interest, but for want of permission. This is one of them. He made a note at the top of the relevant pages in his careful, unhurried hand. Not for publication, JSIW. No explanation beyond those 4 words. No date of intended release. Just that quiet instruction, written as though to himself as much as to any future reader. He kept the promise because it was the right thing to do, and because the woman at the centre of it, not Miss Marple, but the young woman she came to protect, deserved to live her life without the weight of a published account following her like a shadow. Watson thought about this case often in the years after, not with regret exactly, more with the particular tenderness one reserves for moments of unexpected grace, for the times when life delivers without warning someone who sees the world entirely differently from oneself, and yet arrives at the same conclusions. That is how he thought of Miss Jane Marple, and that is where this story begins. It was the 3rd week of October, and London had settled into the kind of wet autumn that seems less like weather and more like a mood. The rain was not dramatic. It made no great show of itself, produced no rolling thunder or theatrical lightning. It simply fell, steadily, patiently, as though it had all the time in the world and intended to use every minute of it. The streets of Baker Street glistened under the gas lamps, their light fractured and doubled in the shallow puddles collecting along the curb, so that the whole road appeared to be lit from below as much as above. A gentle, uncertain luminescence that suited the evening perfectly. Inside 221B, the fire had been well attended since 4 o'clock. Mrs. Hudson had seen to that. She had also seen to the tea things, the fresh supply of tobacco in the Persian slipper, and the discreet removal of 3 chemical experiments from the mantelpiece, the results of which she had described with great economy of expression as not suitable for company. Whether company was expected or not, she had prepared for it. This was her particular genius, not the genius of deduction or of pattern recognition, but the quiet, undervalued genius of readiness. The rooms at 221B were always, under her management, a degree more comfortable than they had any right to be. Watson sat by, the window with a medical journal open across his knee, though he had not turned a page in 20 minutes. The rain against the glass was more interesting than the journal. It ran in thin, wandering lines down the pane, each one beginning confidently and losing its direction halfway, branching and merging with its neighbours in a manner that was, when one watched long enough, almost hypnotic. Outside, the street was nearly empty. A hansom cab passed at intervals, its horses' hoofs muffled and patient on the wet cobblestones. A figure or 2 hurried past with umbrellas tilted against the wind. London, in October rain, had a particular talent for making the indoors feel extraordinarily warm and the outdoors feel extraordinarily far away. Holmes was in his chair. This is a statement that requires some elaboration, because Holmes, in his chair, was a condition with several distinct gradations, and Watson had learned to read them with reasonable accuracy. There was Holmes in his chair but thinking, which produced an absolute stillness broken only by the occasional long draw on his pipe. There was Holmes in his chair and bored, which produced a restless energy even in stillness, a tap of fingers, a slight tension in the jaw, the sense of a mind pushing against its own walls. And there was Holmes in his chair and waiting, which looked almost identical to the first, but carried about it a particular quality of attention, a subtle aliveness, like a compass needle settling north. This evening, Watson believed it was the third. He had not said anything. Holmes rarely announced such things. But there had been the letter that morning, brief, written on cream notepaper in a hand Watson did not recognize. And there had been Holmes's characteristic response to it, which was to read it twice, fold it with unusual care, and then say nothing whatsoever about it for the remainder of the day. This, in Watson's long experience, was the behaviour of a man who was interested. The clock on the mantelpiece read 7:30 when they heard the bell. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs were followed by a knock, and then by the door opening with the particular courtesy she reserved for guests she had already decided to approve of. The approval, Watson would later reflect, was interesting in itself. Mrs. Hudson's instincts were rarely wrong, and they operated on some frequency below the level of rational analysis, much like the subject of the evening's visit. "A Miss Marple," Mrs. Hudson announced, with the small additional pause that indicated she found this entirely adequate as a description. "She says she was expected." Holmes rose from his chair with an ease that suggested he had been, in fact, waiting. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps the good kettle, if you would, not the everyday one." Watson set his journal aside. The woman who entered 221B a moment later was elderly, slight, and entirely herself. That is the most accurate way Watson could later find to describe the first impression Miss Jane Marple made. She was, to an unusual degree, entirely and comfortably herself. She was dressed in good wool, a soft grey blue that suited the October evening, with a hat of the kind that suggested sensibility over fashion, and had probably been chosen with great care on exactly those grounds. She carried a small bag and a neatly folded umbrella, both of which she surrendered to the coat stand near the door with the practised ease of a woman accustomed to entering other people's homes without making a production of it. Her face was what one might call, with affection, a country face, fine-boned, clear-eyed, carrying the gentle weathering of a life lived with windows open and walks taken seriously. Her eyes were blue, very blue, and held in them an expression that Watson could only describe as kind attention, the particular quality of a person who is genuinely interested in what they see and has, over a long lifetime, learned to look without appearing to stare. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her voice was soft and pleasant, with a slight country cadence that London hadn't quite trained out of certain people, and, in Watson's opinion, was better for not doing so. "How very good of you to see me this evening. I hope I am not intruding upon your time." "Not at all, Miss Marple," Holmes said, gesturing toward the chair across from his own. The good chair, Watson noted, not the usual one set out for clients. "I received Lady Stanhope's note with interest. Please sit down. This is my colleague and friend, Dr. Watson, in whom you may place complete confidence." Miss Marple turned to Watson with a smile of such genuine warmth that he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, straightening in his chair. "Dr. Watson," she said, "I have read your accounts, of course. You write with great feeling." "You are very kind," Watson said, and meant it. Mrs. Hudson arrived with the good kettle and the good cups. There was, in Watson's experience, a clear hierarchy of teacups at 221B, though it was never spoken of directly. and the fire settled at that moment with a small, comfortable sound, and the rain continued its patient conversation with the windows, and the room arranged itself, as good rooms will, around its occupants. Miss Marple accepted her tea with both hands around the cup, in the manner of someone who has spent considerable time in draughty English rooms and knows the value of warmth held close. Holmes sat back in his chair and regarded her with the quality of attention he gave to things that interested him, which was to say, the full and genuine article, unfiltered by social performance. "Lady Stanhope writes that you have a concern," he said, "about a young woman in your care." "My niece Clara," Miss Marple said. She set her cup down on the small table beside her, with a care that was not nervousness. More, Watson thought, the careful, been close, and she considers me, I think, my niece. She is the daughter of my late cousin Raymond's wife, by her first marriage. But we have always been close, and she considers me, I think, in the nature of an aunt. She is 26, and she is engaged. "And the engagement concerns you," Holmes said. "The man concerns me," Miss Marple said, with quiet precision. "His name is Fabian Doyle. He is charming, attentive, well-dressed, and appears to have no particular profession beyond the management of certain private investments, the nature of which he describes with great fluency and very little specificity." She paused. "He reminds me," she continued, in the same unhurried tone, "of 3 different people I have known in St. Mary Mead. None of them were pleasant." There was a brief silence. The rain tapped at the glass. The fire breathed. Watson watched Holmes, because it was always instructive to watch Holmes receive information he was not, yet, certain what to do with. The slight tension about the eyes, the very faint tilt of the head, the quality of stillness that meant not dismissal, but suspension of judgment. He was listening, but he was not yet convinced. "Village comparisons," Holmes said, at last, carefully neutral, "are not always—" "No," Miss Marple agreed, with a gentleness that was also unmistakably a refusal to be deflected. "They are not always accurate. I am aware of that, Mr. Holmes. I am an old woman from a small village, and I make no claims beyond my experience. But my experience is, perhaps, a little wider than it appears." She picked up her tea again. "People are very much the same everywhere, in my observation. The scale changes, the particulars change, but the type is remarkably consistent." Holmes looked at her for a long moment, then, very slightly, he smiled. "Tell me," he said, "about the 3 people in St. Mary Mead." Watson reached quietly for his own cup. Outside, London went on in its patient rain-soaked way, quite unaware that something rather interesting had just begun. The fire had burned down a little by the time Miss Marple finished speaking. Not dramatically. It was not that kind of evening. It simply settled, as autumn fires do, from its earlier brightness into something quieter and more considered, a steady amber warmth that suited the conversation perfectly. Watson had refilled the cups once, and Mrs. Hudson had appeared briefly in the doorway with the biscuit tin, assessed the room with her customary accuracy, left the tin on the side table without a word, and withdrawn. It was, Watson thought, one of her finer performances. Miss Marple had been talking for perhaps 20 minutes, not rapidly. She was not a rapid talker. She spoke in the way that certain very observant people speak, with pauses built in not from uncertainty, but from the habit of precision, the small hesitations of someone who means exactly what they say and is, taking care to say exactly that. Holmes had not interrupted her once. This, in itself, was notable. The first, Miss Marple said, setting down her cup with that same careful deliberateness, was a man called Bertram Good, a perfectly pleasant name for a perfectly unpleasant man. He arrived in St. Mary Mead some years ago, a widower, he said, from Shropshire, very well dressed, very attentive to the ladies of the village, particularly those of independent means. He had a way of listening to a woman speak that made her feel she was the most interesting person in any room. She paused, which is, of course, a considerable gift. The difficulty was that he listened in the way a jeweller examines a stone, not for pleasure, but for value. Holmes had his fingertips pressed together, elbows resting on the arms of his chair, in the attitude Watson privately thought of as his receiving posture. The physical arrangement he adopted when information was coming in faster than he wished, to process it aloud. He left St. Mary Mead, Holmes said, before anything could be proved. He left, Miss Marple said with a small, precise nod. 2 weeks before Mrs. Arbuthnot discovered that the pearl brooch she had just shown him over tea, quite innocently, had been replaced with a very good imitation. She had not, until that moment, known that such a thing was possible. It was a lesson she found expensive, and, I think, rather humiliating. And the second? Holmes asked. A young man by the name of Philip Satterthwaite. No relation to the Satterthwaites of Derbyshire, though he implied otherwise. He was perhaps 30, and Clara's Mr. Doyle has something of his quality, that particular ease in a room, the way of moving through social occasions as though they had been arranged specifically for his comfort. She smoothed a fold in her skirt, a small, absent gesture. Philip Satterthwaite became engaged to 2 women simultaneously in the same village. Radius was perhaps 1 mile. He managed it for nearly 4 months before the situation resolved itself, as these situations will, with a great deal of distress, and a Sunday morning that the vicar still speaks of with a troubled expression. Watson made a sound that he quickly converted into a cough. Holmes's expression did not change, but something in his eyes acknowledged the moment. And the third? Watson asked, because Holmes had fallen briefly into his considering silence, and Watson had learned that questions asked in those silences were sometimes more welcome than they appeared. Miss Marple looked at him with a warmth that suggested she appreciated the prompt. The third was a woman, actually, a Mrs. Doris Crail. She is relevant because of what she taught me to look for, rather than what she did. She folded her hands in her lap. Mrs. Crail was the most charming person I have ever met, genuinely charming, not performed, not calculated, simply naturally and deeply pleasant to be near. Everyone liked her, and she used that likability as one uses a good coat, to move through all weathers without being touched by any of them. Holmes was very still. She was never caught doing anything wrong, Miss Marple continued. I want to be clear about that. But things went wrong, with a certain consistency, in her vicinity. Small things, misunderstandings that benefited her, errors that seemed to fall in her favour, a will that was altered, though the alteration was never traced to any particular hand. She met Holmes's gaze with that quality of clear-eyed calm. The pattern was not in any single event. It was in the accumulation. The clock on the mantelpiece counted several seconds. Mr. Doyle, Holmes said slowly, reminds you of all three. Different aspects, Miss Marple said. Mr. Good's attention, Mr. Satterthwaite's ease, Mrs. Crale's impermeability, one might call it. The sense that nothing quite sticks to him. She paused. He's very kind to Clara. I want to say that clearly. I have watched him with her on 3 separate visits, and he is attentive and warm, and remembers small things she has mentioned. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite something. Another pause, softer. But it is also a skill, and skills are different from instincts. Holmes unfolded his hands and looked at her for a long, quiet moment, the kind of look Watson associated with recalibration. He had seen it before, usually when evidence arrived that revised rather than confirmed an existing hypothesis. Holmes did not resist such moments. He had, and Watson considered this one of his finer qualities, a genuine appetite for being surprised. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "you came here expecting scepticism." "I came here expecting to be listened to," she said with a slight smile. "The scepticism I took as given." "Then let me offer you something instead." Holmes rose from his chair, not restlessly, but with the particular economy of movement, of a man who has decided on a direction, and moved to the mantelpiece, where he stood for a moment, looking at the fire. "What you describe is not gossip, nor is it intuition in the pejorative sense. You have identified a method, a pattern of behavior expressed across multiple individuals, filtered through your observation of a contained social environment across many years." He turned. "The village, in this reading, functions as a laboratory, small enough to observe the full cycle, human enough to recur." Miss Marple looked at him with an expression that Watson found difficult to read precisely, but which contained, somewhere in it, the quiet satisfaction of someone who has waited a long time to be accurately described. "That is," she said, "rather well put." "The question," Holmes continued, returning to his chair, "is whether Mr. Fabian Doyle represents a pattern we can document, or merely one we can perceive." He settled. "Perception, I'm afraid, is not sufficient for any action that would protect your niece without causing her additional harm. She would not, I imagine, welcome being told that her fiancé reminds her elderly aunt of 3 unpleasant villagers." "She would not," Miss Marple agreed, without any particular distress. "She would think I was being an interfering old woman, which, of course, I am. But one can be interfering and correct simultaneously. The two are not mutually exclusive." Watson smiled at his hands. Holmes looked at Miss Marple with what Watson could only describe as dawning respect. Not the sudden variety, but the gradual kind, the sort that arrives as accumulation rather than revelation. "You said he reminds you of Mr. Good in his attentiveness," Holmes said. "And Mr. Good, you mentioned, had an interest in jewellery. Has anything of that nature surfaced with Doyle?" Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Miss Marple's expression. Not alarm. Something quieter than alarm. The look of a person who has noted that the conversation has arrived at a particular door, and is waiting to see how it will be opened. "Clara's engagement ring," she said, "is a very handsome sapphire in an old gold setting. It belonged, Mr. Doyle told her, to his grandmother. Clara showed it to me on my last visit to London." A pause. "I do not know a great deal about gemstones, Mr. Holmes, but I know what old gold looks like, and the setting was old. The stone, I am not certain, was the same stone that had always been in it." Holmes looked at her for a beat of absolute stillness. "You said nothing to Clara," he said. "I said it was a beautiful ring," Miss Marple replied. "Which it was. The copy, if it is a copy, is a very good one." Watson reached for his pen, then thought better of it. There was something about the quality of silence in the room that he did not want to interrupt with the scratch of writing. He would remember it clearly enough. Some moments lodged themselves without assistance. "There is one thing I should tell you," Miss Marple added, in the same measured tone she had used throughout, "which I perhaps should have mentioned at the beginning. A few weeks ago, Clara mentioned in passing that a previous tenant of the boarding house where Mr. Doyle takes his rooms, a man by the name of Hartley, had left quite suddenly. No forwarding address. The landlady, a Mrs. Peel, was, according to Clara, somewhat tight-lipped on the subject. She smoothed her skirt again. "It may be nothing. Mr. Hartley may have had excellent private reasons for leaving without notice. Many people do." "Many people do," Holmes agreed, in a tone that suggested he found this observation interesting rather than reassuring. Outside, the rain continued its patient ministry. A carriage went past in the street below, its wheels hissing through the gathered water, and the sound came up through the window in a brief warm rush before fading back into the general voice of the evening. Miss Marple gathered herself, not in the sense of preparing to leave, but in the sense of someone closing the formal portion of a conversation and settling into something more comfortable. She accepted the last of the tea from the pot that Watson tilted toward her cup, with a nod of thanks that was small and genuine. "I hope," she said, "that I have not wasted your evening." "On the contrary," Holmes said, and this time the warmth in his voice was unmistakable, the warmth of a man who has encountered something that has, unexpectedly, delighted him. "You have given me, Miss Marple, what I find I have rather rarely, a case presented not in facts alone, but in types. Facts I can find independently. Types require a different instrument altogether." He looked at her steadily. "You are, I think, a very fine instrument." Miss Marple received this with the composure of someone accustomed to being underestimated, and therefore not particularly unsettled by being accurately estimated. "You are very kind," she said, "though I suspect you are also, Mr. Holmes, a little surprised." "I am," Holmes said, and did not seem to mind admitting it in the least. Watson walked Miss Marple down to the street himself. Holmes had already moved to his index books, which was his version of a very warm farewell, and held her umbrella while she fastened her coat. The rain was soft now, barely more than a mist, and the gas lamps along Baker Street had that particular quality of autumn lamplight, thick and golden and slightly haloed. "Dr. Watson," Miss Marple said, pausing on the step. "He will look into it properly, won't he? Not simply to humour me." "He's already looking into it," Watson said, which was true. He'd seen Holmes reach for the D-index before they had even left the room. "When he reaches for the index books, Miss Marple, the matter is settled." She smiled at that, a real smile, warm and a little tired, the smile of someone who has carried a worry a certain distance alone, and has now, carefully, handed part of it to someone else. "Good," she said quietly. "Good." Watson watched the cab carry her away down the lamplit street, its wheels sending up small fans of water from the gutters, until it turned at the corner and was absorbed into the amber dark of London at night. When he came back upstairs, Holmes was standing at the window with his pipe unlit and his eyes on the street below, though Miss Marple's cab was long gone. "Well," Watson said. "Fabian Doyle," Holmes said, without turning. "And a man called Hartley, and a ring that was perhaps not entirely what it appeared to be." He was quiet for a moment. "And a woman from St. Mary Mead who notices the things that most people are too comfortable to notice." He picked up his matches at last and lit his pipe, and the small warm flare of it lit his face briefly in the dark of the window, and the rain came on again outside, and the fire settled behind them. And Watson sat down and opened his notebook, and the night folded itself, quietly, around 2:21 B. Holmes did not sleep that night. Watson knew this, not because he had stayed awake to confirm it, but because of the evidence that greeted him the following morning, the particular constellation of a night well spent in thought rather than rest. The pipe had been used extensively. 3 different index volumes lay open on the desk at angles that suggested consultation rather than casual reading, and the fire, which Mrs. Hudson had laid fresh at 7, had been anticipated by Holmes himself, who had clearly kept it going through the small hours, and was now sitting in his chair in the grey morning light with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and is deciding what to do about it. Watson said nothing immediately. He poured himself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had left, settled into his chair, and waited. This was, after 20 years of friendship, his most practised skill. Outside, the rain had paused overnight, but left its evidence everywhere. The streets still dark and gleaming, the plane trees along the pavement dripping with a quiet, considered patience, the sky a low and even grey that promised more before the afternoon. October in London was, Watson had long concluded, less a month than a disposition, a settling in, a preparation for something colder that had not quite arrived yet, but was making its intentions clear. Fabian Doyle, Holmes said without preamble, has, in the past 4 years, existed in 3 counties under circumstances that share several features. He did not reach for notes. He never needed to, which Watson had ceased to find remarkable, and simply found, instead, characteristic. In Wiltshire, 2 years ago, a man fitting his description, charming, well presented, investments of unspecified nature, was briefly known to a widow of comfortable means. The acquaintance ended when a piece of jewellery she had trusted to his care for cleaning was returned to her in a condition she described to a solicitor subsequently as altered. No charges. The widow preferred her dignity to her justice, which is, I'm afraid, a preference Mr. Doyle appears to rely upon. Watson set down his cup. And before Wiltshire? Devonshire. A similar situation, though there the connection was less a widow than a family, a daughter being courted, a father who grew suspicious, and a departure that preceded any formal inquiry by perhaps 10 days. Holmes paused. His name in Devonshire was not Doyle, it was Hartwell. Watson looked up. "Close to Hartley," he said. "Very close to Hartley," Holmes agreed. "A man of consistent habits, our Mr. Doyle. He keeps near to his own name, near to his own manner, near to his own method. He changes the county and the face he shows, but the shape of what he does remains, as Miss Marple would say, quite consistent with the type." Watson thought of Miss Marple's face the previous evening, the particular quality of her patience, not the patience of someone waiting for others to catch up, but the patience of someone who has learned that the catching up will come if she gives it time enough. "She was right," he said. "She was right," Holmes said, and the simplicity of it was, in itself, a kind of compliment. Holmes did not concede accuracy easily or without meaning it. The question now is not whether Doyle is what she suspected, but what precisely he has done, and is doing, and what can be done about it without causing Clara more harm than the situation she is already in. This was, Watson reflected, the particular moral texture of the cases he found most interesting, not the ones where right and wrong were clearly labelled, but the ones where doing the right thing required the careful navigation of several competing kindnesses. Holmes understood this better than people gave him credit for, partly because Holmes did not advertise his understanding of such things, and partly because the popular imagination preferred its detectives without conscience and its mysteries without consequence. They set out at 10:30. The boarding-house on Montague Street was the kind of establishment that had once been a private home of some ambition, and had since made its peace with a different purpose. It stood in a terrace of similar houses, 4 stories, the ground-floor windows dressed with net curtains of the clean but slightly stiff variety that announces respectability without warmth. The brass on the door was well polished. The step had been recently whitened. These were the details, Watson had learned, of a landlady who cared about appearances not from vanity, but from professional pride, a meaningful distinction and a reassuring one. Mrs. Peel answered the door herself. She was perhaps 55, with a broad, capable face, and the kind of stillness about her that suggested she had seen a great many things come and go through her establishment, and had formed reliable opinions about most of them. She looked at Holmes and Watson with the measured assessment of a woman accustomed to making quick and accurate judgments about the people on her doorstep. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "not a question, not quite a welcome, an acknowledgment." "Mrs. Peel," Holmes said pleasantly, "I wonder if we might trouble you for a few minutes of your time. We have some questions, quite gentle ones, I assure you, about one of your tenants." Something moved across Mrs. Peel's face at that, not alarm, but a kind of careful rearrangement, as though she were deciding, quickly and privately, how much of her expression to make available. "You'd better come in," she said. The hall was as Watson had expected from the exterior, clean, slightly formal, with a coat stand, a small table bearing a vase of chrysanthemums that were 3 days past their best, and the particular smell of a well-kept house. Beeswax, a ghost of cooking from somewhere below, and the faint, pleasant staleness of rooms that are lived in by quiet people. A staircase rose at the end of the hall. From somewhere above, a clock ticked with the steady indifference of a clock that has been keeping time in the same house for 30 years and sees no reason to stop. Mrs. Peel showed them into the front sitting-room, a room kept for guests rather than for living, with chairs arranged at slight distances from one another and a small gas fire that she lit without asking whether they wanted it. Watson appreciated this. It was cold. "It's about Mr. Doyle, I take it," she said, settling into the chair nearest the fire with the composure of a woman who has decided that composure is her best available strategy. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say so?" "Because," Mrs. Peel said with careful patience, "you are the second person this week to come to my door with a gentle question. The first was a solicitor's clerk, and he was asking after Mr. Hartley." She folded her hands in her lap. "And Mr. Hartley and Mr. Doyle were known to each other." Watson kept his expression neutral. Holmes kept his expression pleasant. Between them, They produced a combined effect of polite, unhurried interest that had, over the years, encouraged a great many people to continue speaking. Mrs. Peel continued speaking. "Mr. Hartley took the first-floor room for 8 months," she said. "He was a quiet tenant, paid on time, no trouble with the other residents. He and Mr. Doyle, who is a friend of my current second-floor tenant, Miss Holt, would sometimes meet here in this room for a drink in the evenings. I thought nothing of it. Men have friends." A pause. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Hartley left, very suddenly. A Saturday morning. He came down with his bags already packed, paid what he owed me, and 1 week in addition, and said he had been called away on a family matter. Her hands tightened fractionally in her lap. He had never mentioned family before. In 8 months. And since then? Holmes asked. "Nothing," Mrs. Peel said. "No forwarding address, no letter. I have had his correspondence sitting on the hall table for 3 weeks, 2 envelopes, both look like bills, and nowhere to send them." She paused again. "And then the solicitor's clerk, and now you." Holmes looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Peel, I want to ask you something directly, and I hope you will answer me in the same spirit. In the days before Mr. Hartley left, did anything seem different to you? In him, or in the house, or in his interactions with Mr. Doyle?" Mrs. Peel was quiet for a moment. That was not hesitation, but thought. "They had words," she said finally. "The Thursday before he left. I didn't hear what was said. I wasn't listening, Mr. Holmes, I want to be clear about that. But I heard the tone of it, coming up from the hall. Mr. Doyle's voice. Not angry, exactly." She searched for the word. "Firm," she said. "The way someone speaks when they've decided something. And they're telling thee, would it be possible for us to see the room Mr. Hartley occupied? I understand it may already be let again." "It isn't?" she said. "I haven't been in a hurry to fill it." A slight pause. "I'm not entirely sure why." The first-floor room was plain and clean, with the anonymous tidiness of a space that had been occupied lightly and left without ceremony. A single window looked out over the narrow strip of rear garden, a patch of lawn gone slightly pale with autumn, a wall with ivy, the backs of the houses in the next street, their upper windows grey with reflected sky. The furniture was solid and impersonal. A bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk near the window, a small bookshelf with 3 volumes left behind, a railway timetable for the previous year, a novel Watson didn't recognise, and a pocket guide to Bristol and the surrounding area. Holmes moved through the room in the particular way he had in spaces he was examining, not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the quiet thoroughness of a man following a thought through its physical evidence. He opened the wardrobe, looked at the shelf within, closed it. He checked the underside of the writing desk. He stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the grey garden below. Then he crouched beside the grate. The fire had not been laid since Hartley left. The ash in the grate was old and cold, pale grey with a slight crust from a damp morning that had come in under the window at some point. Holmes examined it briefly, then reached in with 2 fingers and extracted something small. A fragment of paper, not fully burned, perhaps an inch square, its edges brown and crinkled, but its centre still holding the ghost of some printed text. He looked at it for a moment, then tucked it into his breast pocket. "Bristol," Watson said quietly, nodding toward the pocket guide on the shelf. Bristol, Holmes agreed. Miss Marple arrived at 3:30. This had been arranged that morning via a note delivered to her London address, a niece's flat in Kensington, where she was staying for the week. She came without fuss, in the same grey-blue wool, with an additional scarf against the afternoon chill, and Mrs. Peel received her with the instinctive recognition of one capable woman acknowledging another. Watson noticed this. He thought Miss Marple noticed it too, though she said nothing about it directly. The four of them sat in the front sitting-room with fresh tea. Mrs. Peel had produced it without being asked, which Watson took as a sign of something settling in her. And the conversation moved in the careful, comfortable way of people who are each telling as much of the truth as they currently know. Miss Marple asked Mrs. Peel about the house, and how long she had kept it, and whether the chrysanthemums in the hall were from her own garden. They were, as it happened, a small garden behind the kitchen, not much space, but enough for the hardier things. Miss Marple said that chrysanthemums were admirably reliable, and that she herself grew them in St. Mary Mead with great success. And Mrs. Peel said that reliability was an undervalued quality, and Watson had the sense that this exchange, apparently about flowers, had established something between the two women that no more direct approach could have managed in twice the time. It was during this conversation, quiet and unhurried, that Miss Marple asked, entirely in passing, with her eyes on her teacup, whether Mr. Doyle had ever brought anyone else to the house, besides Miss Holt. Mrs. Peel considered. "Once," she said. "A young woman, about a month ago. Very pretty, very nicely dressed. He introduced her to me in the hall as his fiancée." A pause. She was wearing a very handsome ring, a sapphire. Miss Marple looked up. Her expression was, as always, composed, but something in it, some particular quality of careful attention, sharpened almost imperceptibly. "A sapphire in an old gold setting?" she asked, very quietly. Mrs. Peel looked at her. "Yes," she said, "that's right." The fire in the small grate popped once, lightly. The clock in the hall continued its indifferent counting. Outside, the afternoon had darkened toward an early dusk, and the street lamps were beginning to gather their light. Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes was looking at his hands, pressed together, fingertip to fingertip, and his expression was the expression of a man who has heard what he expected to hear, and finds it, in the event, no more pleasant for having expected it. "Mrs. Peel," Holmes said after a moment, "when Mr. Hartley left, did he say anything at all about his plans? Any name, any destination, any connection?" Mrs. Peel thought. "He said," she recalled slowly, "that he might be in the subject of Bristol." But Watson saw his face. "No," Holmes said quietly. "No, of course not." He did not say anything further on the subject of Bristol, but Watson saw his hand move briefly to his breast pocket, where the fragment of paper sat, and stay there for a moment, as though confirming its presence, before returning to rest. Miss Marple finished her tea. She complimented Mrs. Peel on the scones, which had appeared at some point without anyone quite noticing, and which were, Watson noted, excellent. She asked after the second-floor tenant, Miss Holt, with the casual interest of someone simply being conversational, and Mrs. Peel said that Miss Holt was a nervous sort, a secretary at a firm in the city, kept very regular hours, and had seemed rather unsettled lately, though she couldn't say why. Miss Marple nodded at this with the expression of someone filing a detail away carefully, between other details, in a place where it would be easy to find. Once at the boarding house on Montague, Street, its polished brass, its clean step, its net curtains holding back the interior dark, and thought that houses, like people, held more inside them than their careful exteriors suggested. Miss Marple appeared beside him, opening her umbrella with the practised ease of someone who has spent considerable time in the English autumn. "Mrs. Peel knows more than she said," she remarked, in the tone of someone observing the weather. "She does," Watson agreed. "She is protecting herself," Miss Marple said, "not from us, from the possibility that she failed to see something she should have seen in her own house, under her own roof." A pause. "That is a very particular kind of fear. I have a great deal of sympathy for it." She stepped out into the rain with her umbrella tilted against the wind, and Watson followed, and Holmes was already ahead of them on the pavement, his coat dark with the first fine drops, his face turned slightly toward the grey middle distance, with the expression of a man who has several questions and is deciding which one to follow first. Behind them, the door of the boarding house closed softly. Somewhere inside, a clock kept counting. Watson had always believed that the most truthful conversations happened sideways, not face to face, with the weight of direct inquiry pressing down on both parties, but at an angle, over tea, beside a window, in the pauses between one subject and the next. People did not, as a rule, intend to reveal themselves. They simply did, in the unguarded moments between intentions. Miss Marple understood this better than anyone he had ever met. The following morning broke pale and cold, the rain temporarily exhausted, and the sky a thin, washed white that gave the city a slightly exposed quality, as though London had been caught without its usual grey overcoat. Holmes had gone out early. Watson heard the door at 8:15, the particular sound of it that meant purposeful departure rather than restless wandering, and had left a note on the breakfast table in his small, precise hand, tracing Doyle's financial connections. Back by 2. Take Miss Marple to the boarding house. She will know what to do. Watson had looked at this note for a moment, then folded it and put it in his pocket, and reflected that there were worse instructions to be given on a cold October morning. Miss Marple arrived at 9:30, slightly earlier than arranged, with the air of someone who has been awake since 6 and has been patient about it. She accepted coffee rather than tea, which surprised Watson mildly, and sat at the breakfast table with a small bag on her knee, and her eyes moving with quiet interest around the room, taking in, he suspected, a great deal more than she appeared to. "Mr. Holmes is already at work, Watson, kind who thinks better when still. Between kind who thinks better when still. Between us, we should manage." They returned to Montague Street at 10. Mrs. Peel received them with the settled manner of someone who had made a decision overnight and was comfortable with it. The decision, Watson inferred, to be more forthcoming than she had been the previous afternoon. She showed them into the sitting room again, and this time sat with them rather than across from them, a small but legible shift. "Miss Holt is in," she said. "She doesn't go into the office on Thursdays. I mentioned you might be calling, and she said she would speak with you, though she was." A small hesitation. "Nervous about it." "She need not be nervous," Miss Marple said, with a warmth that was both genuine and precisely calibrated. We are not here to cause difficulty for anyone in this house." Mrs. Peel nodded. Then, with the manner of someone releasing something they have been holding at some effort, she said, "Mr. Hartley came back." Watson kept his expression still. "Once," Mrs. Peel continued, "about a week after he left, a Tuesday evening, he knocked at the back, the kitchen door, not the front. And I let him in because I did. He looked thin, tired." She smoothed the arm of her chair with one hand. "He asked me not to mention to Mr. Doyle that he had been. He said it very quietly, very seriously. Then he asked if he had received any post, and I gave him the 2 envelopes, and he thanked me and left." "Did he open them here?" Miss Marple asked. "One of them, a bill, I think. He looked at it and put it in his coat. The other he put away without opening." She paused. His hands were not quite steady. Watson thought of the pocket guide to Bristol, of the fragment of burned paper in Holmes's breast pocket, of a man who had lived quietly in a boarding house, for 8 months, paid his rent, caused no trouble, and then left on a Saturday morning after a conversation held in a firm voice he had not been part of. "Mrs. Peel," he said gently, "did Mr. Hartley say anything else? Anything at all?" She was quiet for a moment. "He said, and I didn't know what to make of it at the time, he said it wasn't supposed to go this far. Just that. I didn't ask what he meant. I suppose I didn't want to know." A pause. "I've thought about it a good deal since." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply looked at Mrs. Peel with that expression of clear, kind attention, and the silence she offered was not uncomfortable, but somehow generous. The silence of a person who understands that some things need a moment before they can be carried. Miss Holt was 28, slight, with careful hair and the contained manner of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible and has come to think of this as a personal quality rather than a habit of self-protection. She sat across from Miss Marple in the small upstairs sitting room that Mrs. Peel had made available, with a cup of tea she held in both hands and did not drink from, and Watson sat slightly to one side and slightly back, which he had learned was the appropriate arrangement when Miss Marple was talking to someone. He was, on these occasions, essentially a witness. He did not mind this. Miss Marple asked Miss Holt about her work first, the firm, the nature of it, how long she had been there, whether she found it satisfying. These weren't preamble questions, Watson had learned. They were Miss Marple's version of foundation work, establishing the person before examining the event, understanding the instrument before considering what it had recorded. Miss Holt's work was legal correspondence, and she'd been at the firm for 4 years, and she found it, here a slight pause, steady. Watson noted the word. Not satisfying, steady. "You know Mr. Doyle, I think," Miss Marple said, after a natural interval, in the tone of someone simply continuing a pleasant conversation. Miss Holt's cup moved fractionally in her hands. "He is a friend of a friend," she said. "I see him occasionally, when he visits the house." "He seems very charming," Miss Marple observed. "He is." A pause. "He is very easy to be around." "Yes," Miss Marple said, with a warmth of understanding that was not quite agreement. "Some people are. It is rather a gift, isn't it? Though like all gifts, one wonders sometimes what it is being used for." Miss Holt looked at her. Something in the girl's contained expression shifted, not breaking open, nothing so sudden, but loosening slightly at the edges, the way ice shifts in late winter before it becomes water. "He asked me once," she said slowly, "about the legal aspects of gemstone substitution, whether it constituted fraud in every case, or whether intent was relevant." A pause. He framed it as a hypothetical, a question about a story he'd been reading. Watson said nothing. Miss Marple said nothing. The room was very quiet. "I told him intent was central to any fraud determination," Miss Holt continued, her voice quite steady now. "The steadiness of someone who has decided to be honest and is discovering it is easier than they expected." He seemed satisfied with that. He said it was a very interesting area of law, and thanked me for explaining it. She looked at her cup. "I thought nothing of it at the time." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "How would you have?" Miss Holt looked up at her. "Is Clara all right?" she asked, and the name came out with the particular weight of a word that has been sitting unspoken for some time. "I have met her twice. When Mr. Doyle brought her here, she seemed very happy." "She is, at present, quite all right," Miss Marple said, "and it is our intention that she remains so." Something in Miss Holt's face settled at this. The particular settling of someone who has been carrying a concern alone, and has now passed part of its weight to more appropriate hands. "I should have said something sooner," she said. "You said it now," Miss Marple replied. "That is what matters." Watson walked with Miss Marple afterward through the pale October streets, taking the longer route back toward the main road where cabs could be found, and the city moved around them in its ordinary way. A delivery cart, 2 women with shopping baskets, a small dog being walked with considerably more ambition than its legs entirely supported. She knew more than she initially admitted, Watson said. She knew enough to be uncomfortable, Miss Marple said, but not enough to be certain. That is a very difficult position. One does not want to accuse a man of something one cannot fully prove, particularly when one is a young woman in a professional position with a landlady who expects quiet and respectable tenants. She walked with the slight deliberateness of someone whose knees register cold weather as a personal imposition. She was not dishonest. She was cautious. There is a considerable difference. "Holmes will want her account of the conversation about gemstones," Watson said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It is the most concrete thing we have so far, beyond my own observations and Mrs. Peel's impressions." A pause. "Though I have always felt that impressions, properly examined, are more reliable than they are given credit for. An impression is simply a pattern observed before it has been fully articulated." They walked on in comfortable silence for a moment. A gust of wind came along the street with the particular October intention of making itself known, and Miss Marple adjusted her scarf without breaking stride. "Miss Holt's question," Watson said, "about intent and fraud." Yes. If Doyle asked her that, if he was establishing, through her, the legal threshold for prosecution, then he has thought quite carefully about what he is doing. He has thought carefully about what he is doing for a very long time, I imagine, Miss Marple said. That is rather the nature of the type. She glanced at him sideways, and there was in her expression something that was not quite sadness, and not quite anger, something more considered than either, the particular feeling of someone who has seen a pattern repeat across a lifetime and finds it still a source of quiet grief. They are not impulsive people. That would be easier, in a way. Impulsive people make mistakes from heat. These ones make choices from cold, and they make them carefully, and they rely on the fact that most people around them are warm enough, and trusting enough, and kind enough to leave them room to do it. A cab appeared at the end of the street. Watson raised his hand. "Holmes will have the financial picture by 2, he said. "And then," Miss Marple said, accepting his hand as she stepped up into the cab, "we will know what kind of man we are dealing with, though I confess." She settled herself, folded her hands on her bag, looked out at the pale London street with those clear blue eyes. "I already know." Watson climbed in after her. The cab moved off. Behind them, Montague Street receded into the ordinary texture of the city, its polished brass and clean step holding their patient positions quite unchanged. The clock inside, Watson was fairly certain, was still counting. Holmes was back at 1:30. Watson heard him on the stairs, the particular rhythm of it, quick and purposeful, the step of a man who has found what he went looking for, and is now impatient to do something about it. He came through the door of 221B, with his coat still on, and his hat in his hand, and went directly to his desk, where he laid out 3 separate documents with the focused efficiency of someone arranging the final pieces, of something that has taken considerable effort to assemble. Watson and Miss Marple were already there. Mrs. Hudson had provided lunch, which Watson had eaten, and Miss Marple had eaten, and Holmes had walked past without appearing to notice. This was not unusual. When Holmes was at a certain point in a case, the point where the shape of it was becoming clear, but the details were still being pressed into their final positions, food became a theoretical concept he acknowledged in principle and deferred in practice. Miss Marple watched him with an expression of quiet, interested attention. She had, Watson noticed, moved her chair very slightly, by perhaps 2 inches, to a position from which she could see both Holmes at his desk and the door to the landing. He did not think she had done this consciously. He thought it was simply the habitual arrangement of someone who has learned, over a long lifetime, to keep as much of a room in view as possible. "Fabian Doyle," Holmes said, without preamble, standing at his desk with his hands flat on the documents before him, "has been, at various points in the past 6 years, Fabian Hartwell of Devonshire, Francis Daw of Wiltshire, and, I strongly suspect, though cannot yet fully confirm, one Frederick Holton of Bath, whose connection to a disputed estate matter in 1928 I have sent to a contact to verify." He looked up. "The names are instructive. He keeps the initials. FD, FH, FD again, and now FD once more. A small vanity, or perhaps simply the practical convenience of initialed possessions that need not be replaced." "The finances?" Watson asked. Holmes straightened. "Each incarnation follows the same arc. Arrival in a new location, presentation as a man of private means, rapid social integration through charm and attentiveness, identification of a target, always a woman of some financial independence, always through a connection that provides initial credibility, and then the substitution." He paused on the word. "It is always jewelry, always a piece of sentimental rather than purely monetary value, which is, in its way, the most calculating aspect of the method. Sentimental pieces are less likely to be independently valued. Owners are less likely to have documentation, and the emotional cost of pursuing a claim publicly, of admitting that one was deceived, that the ring or brooch or necklace one trusted to a charming man's keeping is not the one that came back, is, for most women in most social positions, simply too high. Miss Marple nodded slowly, once, with the expression of someone hearing a thing confirmed that they had long suspected, and find no satisfaction in the confirmation. "He has relied," she said, "on the same thing every time, that good manners are a kind of silence." "Precisely," Holmes said, and he looked at her with the directness he reserved for people whose minds he genuinely respected, which was a smaller group than his public reputation might suggest. Each of his previous victims is too strong, perhaps. Each of his previous subjects has chosen, when the moment of potential exposure arrived, to absorb the loss rather than bear the public scrutiny of having been deceived by a man they trusted. A pause. He has understood this. He has banked on it. And until now, it has been a reliable investment. "Clara?" Watson said. "Clara has not yet discovered anything," Holmes said, "which is, at present, our advantage. The ring may or may not have been substituted. Miss Marple's observation suggests it has, and I am inclined to trust Miss Marple's observations. But Clara herself remains, in her own understanding, an engaged woman with a handsome ring and a charming fiancé. We have time, not a great deal of it, but some." He moved from the desk to his chair and sat, and the movement from standing to sitting carried with it a shift in the room's quality, from the brisk energy of information being laid out to the quieter, more concentrated energy of something being thought through. The fire burned. The afternoon had deepened outside, the pale morning light replaced by something thicker and more amber, the early dark of October gathering at the window's edges. Watson's tea had gone cold. He did not bother replacing it. What happened next was something Watson would return to in memory many times in the years following, not because it was dramatic, because it was not, but because it was the kind of moment that reveals character in the way that only quiet moments can. Holmes sat in his chair with his fingertips together and began to speak, methodically and precisely, laying out the factual architecture of what Doyle had done and how it could be demonstrated. The financial trail, the pattern of names, the previous subjects who could, if approached with sufficient delicacy, potentially confirm elements of the account. The fragment of burned paper from Hartley's grate, which had proved, under examination, to contain part of a Bristol address and part of a figure that Holmes believed represented a sum owed. And Miss Marple sat in her chair across the fire from him and listened, and when he had finished, she began to speak. She didn't speak about evidence. She spoke about Doyle himself, about the specific texture of how such a person moves through the world, makes his choices, manages his relationships. She described, with the precision of a naturalist describing a species, the internal logic of someone who has separated charm from feeling so completely that the charm has become entirely autonomous, a tool used with the same detachment one might use a good pen, appreciated for its function, maintained with care, and set down without sentiment when the writing is done. She spoke about the women he had chosen. Not randomly, she said, never randomly. Always women who had learned, through their particular social positions, to be more grateful for attention than perhaps they should need to be. Widows, daughters of careful families, women of independent means who had nonetheless been made to understand, By the accumulated pressure of their world, that independence was a consolation prize rather than a first choice. He found them not because he was cruel, she said, but because he was observant in the particular way of a man who has identified a pattern he can use and has learned to locate it reliably. Holmes listened to all of this without interrupting once. When she finished, there was a silence that was not empty, but full. The silence of two people who have approached the same subject from entirely different directions and arrived simultaneously at the same place. "You describe," Holmes said at last, slowly, "the architecture of the character. I have described the architecture of the acts." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Together they constitute something more complete than either alone. That is," she said with a small, warm precision, "what I hoped you might find." Holmes looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he said, in a slightly different tone, quieter, more interior, "Hartley." The name fell into the room with a different weight than the others. Watson had been waiting for it. Since Bristol had first appeared in the pocket guide on the shelf, in Mrs. Peel's careful recollection, in the address fragment from the burned paper, there had been something beneath the surface of this case that was darker than jewel substitution and social deception, something that had not yet been fully named, but whose shape was becoming discernible, the way a figure becomes visible through fog, not all at once, but gradually, feature by feature. "We know Hartley was connected to Doyle," Watson said carefully. "We know he left suddenly, under what appears to have been pressure. We know he returned once, that his hands were not steady, that he said it wasn't supposed to go this far." He paused. "And we know he went to Bristol." "Where?" Holmes said, still looking at the fire. "A man matching his description was found dead 6 weeks ago. Ruled accidental. A fall." Pause that carried its own particular weight. "I received confirmation from a contact in the Bristol Constabulary this morning. His name in Bristol was Hayward. His first initial was R," Watson said quietly. "R," Holmes confirmed. "Not an F. A departure from the pattern, which suggests Hartley was not one of Doyle's identities, but rather a separate individual, an associate, perhaps, someone who knew enough to be useful and, in the end, knew too much to be comfortable." Miss Marple had been very still through this. She said now, in a voice that was entirely composed and entirely serious, "You cannot prove it." "No," Holmes said, "not in any way that would satisfy a court, not without a witness, without physical evidence connecting Doyle to Bristol, without a chain of documentation that does not currently exist and may never exist." He looked at her. "Which is why I haven't gone to the police, and why I will not yet, and why the question before us is not how to punish Mr. Doyle for what I believe he has done, but how to remove him from Clara's life in a manner that protects her, protects the other women he has wronged, and does not," a pause, "does not allow him simply to move to a new county and begin again." The fire settled with a soft sound. Outside, a cab went by in the street, its wheels on the wet stone making that particular sound Watson associated with autumn evenings in London, hushed and continuous, like the turning of a page. "There is a way," Miss Marple said. Both men looked at her. She had her hands folded in her lap, her teacup set aside, her expression that of someone who's been thinking carefully for some time about a problem and has arrived at a solution that satisfies her on multiple grounds simultaneously. "The difficulty with a man like Mr. Doyle," she said, is not that he is beyond reason. It is that he has always been certain that the people around him will choose their dignity over their justice, and has therefore never seriously been asked to choose between his freedom and his continuation. A pause. One must simply make the calculation visible to him. Not threaten. I do not mean threaten, Mr. Holmes. Threats are both unkind and unreliable. I mean illuminate. She looked between them with those clear blue eyes. He needs to understand, quite plainly, that the pattern has been seen. Not by one person, not by a widow in Wiltshire or a family in Devonshire, but collectively. That the shape of what he does is documented and held, even if it cannot currently be presented in a court. Another pause. And he needs to understand that Miss Holt, who knows something of the law, and Mrs. Peel, who knows something of the world, and a very old woman from St. Mary Mead, who knows something of people, are all sitting quietly with what they know. Holmes regarded her for a long moment. "You propose," he said, "to make the cost of continuing too high, without force, without formal accusation." "I propose," she said, "to have a conversation." Watson looked at Holmes. Holmes looked at Miss Marple. The afternoon light had gone entirely now. The room held in the warm amber glow of the fire and the lamps, and London breathed outside with its patient, anonymous immensity. And somewhere in it, a man called Fabian Doyle was entirely unaware that two of the most perceptive people Watson had ever encountered had spent the afternoon building, from opposite ends, a very precise and accurate picture of exactly who he was. "When?" Watson asked. "Tomorrow," Holmes said. He was already reaching for his pen. "And Miss Marple?" He looked up, and there was in his expression something Watson recognized as the rarest of his qualities. Not admiration, exactly, but its close and genuine cousin. "Will you be present?" "I would not," she said, "miss it for anything." The morning of the meeting arrived with the particular quietness of days that know they are significant. Not dramatically. London did not rearrange itself for the occasion. The rain returned overnight, as it had been threatening to do for days, and settled in by dawn with the comfortable permanence of a guest who has decided to stay through lunch. The streets of the city moved in their ordinary rhythms, the milk cart, the newspaper boys, the early office workers with their umbrellas and their expressions of resigned acceptance. Mrs. Hudson brought breakfast at 8, and noted, with the precision of long experience, that Holmes had eaten his toast and left his eggs, which meant he was thinking hard, but not yet agitated. Watson ate both his eggs and Holmes's, on the grounds that someone ought to. Miss Marple arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. She was dressed with a particular care that was none the less entirely understated. A good grey coat, her best hat, gloves of a soft fawn leather that Watson suspected she reserved for occasions that required both warmth and composure. She accepted tea, declined breakfast, and sat in the good chair with her small bag on her knee, and the expression of someone who has slept well, because they have thought a thing through completely and have no remaining argument with themselves about it. Holmes had sent a note to Doyle the previous evening, brief, formally courteous, requesting the pleasure of a meeting at 221B on a matter of some delicacy concerning a mutual acquaintance. He had signed it simply with his name, which was, in London, in 1935, a sufficient signature. Whatever Fabian Doyle felt upon receiving it, he had replied within the hour, confirming his attendance at 10 o'clock. which Holmes had observed was the response of a man who understood that declining would tell its own story. "He will come prepared," Holmes said, standing at the window with his coffee, watching the rain. "He will have a version of events ready. He will be charming, cooperative, and entirely plausible. He will have answers for everything we raise that are not technically lies, but are constructed to leave the most important truths unaddressed." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is exactly what he will do." "Then we will not," Holmes said, turning from the window, "raise things as questions he can answer. We will present them as things we already know." "There is one additional element," Miss Marple said, in the tone of someone raising a point they have been considering carefully. "Clara." Holmes looked at her. "She should not hear this from a third party afterward," Miss Marple said. "Whatever is said in this room this morning, whatever conclusion is reached, Clara must be told something. Not everything, but enough. And it must be told to her in a way that allows her to understand what has happened without being diminished by it." She paused. "She is a sensible young woman. She is not fragile. The difficulty is not that she cannot bear the truth. It is that the truth, delivered badly, can do more damage than the original wrong." "You will tell her," Watson said. "I will tell her," Miss Marple confirmed. "After, when we know what there is to tell." Watson nodded. Holmes returned to his chair. The three of them sat for a few minutes in a companionable quiet that was also, in its way, a kind of preparation, the stillness before a thing begins, that allows each person to settle into their own particular quality of readiness. The fire was good. The rain was steady. Outside, the city went about its business, entirely indifferent. Fabian Doyle arrived at 3 minutes past 10. He was, Watson would acknowledge, exactly as advertised. Tall, well-built, with the kind of face that photographed handsomely and aged gracefully, and gave nothing away in the present moment except pleasantness. He was dressed with the particular care of a man who understands that appearance is a form of argument. His coat was excellent. His shoes were excellent. His manner, as he came through the door of 221B and took in the three people waiting for him, Holmes in his chair, Watson to one side, Miss Marple by the fire, was, for just one fraction of a second, not excellent at all. Watson caught it. Miss Marple, he was certain, caught it. It was a very small thing, a microsecond of recalibration, the face rearranging itself from one expectation to the reality it found instead. He had expected Holmes, perhaps Watson. He had not expected the elderly woman in the grey coat and the fawn gloves, sitting by the fire with her hands folded and her eyes resting on him with the calm, kind, absolutely unflinching attention of someone who's seen his type before and found it, in the end, quite recognizable. Then it was gone, and the pleasantness was back, smooth and immediate. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending his hand, "good of you to see me." Holmes shook his hand with the brisk courtesy of a man who is not performing friendliness, but is not being rude either. "Mr. Doyle, please sit down. I believe you know Dr. Watson. And this is Miss Marple, who is known to Miss Clara Ashworth." Doyle turned to Miss Marple with the full warmth of his attention, the smile, the slight incline of the head, the quality of focus that Miss Marple had described as listening the way a jeweller examines a stone. "Miss Marple," he said, "Clara has mentioned you with great affection." "She is a dear girl," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I am very fond of her." The exchange was perfectly ordinary. It was also, Watson sensed, the first of the morning's quiet collisions, Doyle deploying his charm, Miss Marple receiving it without deflection and without warmth, neither hostile nor susceptible, simply present. He sat. Holmes sat. The room arranged itself. "You said in your note," Doyle began, with the ease of a man taking control of a conversation's frame, "a matter of delicacy concerning a mutual acquaintance. I assumed you meant Clara. I hope nothing is wrong." "Nothing is wrong with Clara," Holmes said. "At present." "To hear it," he said. She means to hear it," he said. She means a great deal to me." "I imagine she does," Holmes said in the same neutral tone. "As did, I suspect, the widow in Wiltshire and the family in Devonshire, and, in a different capacity, Mr. Hartley of Montague Street, who went to Bristol 6 weeks ago and was found dead, in circumstances the local constabulary found sufficient to record as accidental." The silence that followed was perhaps 4 seconds long. In those 4 seconds, Watson watched Fabian Doyle with the particular attention of a man who has spent decades observing people under pressure. What he saw was not guilt, exactly, not the visible, uncontained guilt of someone caught without preparation. What he saw was something colder and more considered. The rapid, efficient internal working of a very intelligent man assessing the distance between what had just been said and what could be proved, measuring the gap, deciding whether it was sufficient. He concluded, Watson believed, that it was not sufficient. That Holmes was presenting implication, not evidence. That the mention of Bristol and Hartley was a pressure tactic, a stone dropped to observe the ripples, and that if he kept still enough, the ripples wouldn't reveal anything he had not already decided to conceal. He was, Watson reflected, very nearly right, and the nearly was everything. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Doyle said quite calmly. "About Hartley. It was a tragedy. We had a business arrangement that ended badly. I was sorry to hear about Bristol." "Were you?" Holmes said. "Yes," Doyle said, and his voice was level and his eyes were steady, and he was, Watson thought, quite genuinely formidable. And then Miss Marple spoke. She spoke without raising her voice, without changing her posture, without any of the rhetorical preparation that announces "No, I don't think anyone who knew Mr. No. I don't think anyone who knew Mr. Good would have described him as a bad man. He wasn't angry or violent or particularly greedy in the obvious way. He simply had a great gift for making people feel seen, and he used it consistently and deliberately to take things from them." A pause. "He moved away eventually. I often wondered if he understood, when he left, that the pattern he carried with him was visible, that someone had seen the whole of it, not just the individual pieces." Doyle looked at her. For the first time since entering the room, the pleasantness was not immediate. There was a fractional pause before it reassembled, small enough that most people would not have noticed it, large enough that the 3 people in this particular room did. "I'm not sure what village comparisons have to do with," he began. "The engagement ring," Holmes said, moving forward without pause, "which Clara currently wears and which you told her belonged to your grandmother, is a reproduction. The original stone, a cashmere sapphire of some quality, which I have had independently confirmed through a contact at Garrard's, was removed from the setting at some point in the past 3 months. The replacement is very good. It would not be detected by anyone without specific expertise." A pause. "It was detected by Miss Marple." Doyle's jaw did not tighten. His hands did not move. He was, Watson observed with something close to reluctant admiration, genuinely controlled. "That is a significant accusation," he said. "It is a documented fact," Holmes said. "I have the jeweller's assessment in writing." He did not produce it. He did not need to. "I also have written accounts from 2 residents of the Montague Street boarding house regarding conversations that took place there. Us have financial records from 3 counties suggesting a pattern of behavior extending over 6 years. I have the partial record of your movements under at least 4 names. And I have," the briefest pause, perfectly placed, "a very great deal of patience." The fire settled. The rain moved against the windows. The clock counted. Doyle sat for a moment in a silence that was different in quality from all the silences before it. Not the calculating silence of a man measuring his position, but something fractionally more honest than that. Watson would not have described it as remorse. But it was, perhaps, the silence of a man who has for the first time looked at the full assembled picture of himself, and found it not shocking, exactly, but clarifying. "What do you want?" he said at last. "3 things," Holmes said. "The engagement is ended by your hand, with sufficient kindness and sufficient decisiveness that Clara is not left in doubt or continued hope. It is done within the week. You will tell her it is your failing, not hers. And this, Mr. Doyle, is the one instruction in this conversation that I will hold you to most specifically, because it is the most important." Doyle said nothing. "Second," Holmes continued, "the original stone is returned. Not to me, not to this room. It will be arranged through a third party, quietly, and there will be no discussion of how or when it was taken." A pause. "Mrs. Peel will also receive a sum. I have a figure in mind, which you will consider an overdue settling of accounts." Another silence. Then, "And the third?" Holmes looked at him for a long moment. "You leave London. You do not return to any of the counties I have mentioned. You do not, to the best of my ability to prevent it, repeat this particular occupation in any form I can trace." A pause. "I will be honest with you, Mr. Doyle. I cannot guarantee that I will not revisit the question of Bristol. The matter of Hartley is not closed in my mind, and may not remain closed in the official record, but that is a separate question from this morning's business, and this morning I am concerned with Clara." Miss Marple had been quiet through this entire exchange. Now she said, simply and directly, looking at Doyle with those clear blue eyes, "You are not, I think, entirely without feeling. The care you show Clara is not all performance. I have watched you with her, and I believe some part of it is real." A pause, and her voice was neither harsh nor forgiving, but something more honest than either. "That is perhaps the saddest thing about you, that you have the capacity for it, and you have chosen consistently to use it as a tool instead." She looked at him steadily. "I think you know this. I think you have known it for a long time." The silence that followed that was the longest of the morning. Fabian Doyle looked at the fire. He looked at his hands. He looked, briefly, at nothing in particular. The look of a man visiting some interior room that he does not often open. Then he looked at Holmes. "The ring will be returned by Thursday," he said. "Mrs. Peel's sum. Tell me the figure. The engagement will be ended this week." A pause. "I will write to Clara today." "You will write to Clara today," Holmes confirmed. Doyle rose from his chair with the same easy, unhurried grace he had arrived with. though it carried now a different quality. The grace of a man who has been very precisely and very thoroughly seen, and has decided in the end that retreat is the only available dignity. He buttoned his coat. He picked up his hat. At the door he paused. He did not turn fully. "Miss Marple," he said, to the door rather than to the room. "Yes," she said. A pause. "St. Mary Mead sounds," he said, "like a very dangerous village." "It is," she said pleasantly, "an entirely ordinary village. That is rather the point." The door closed behind him. His footsteps went down the stairs. The front door of 221B opened and closed, and the sound of the street admitted briefly rain, a cart, the ordinary voice of London, and then was sealed away again. Watson let out a breath he had been holding, he realized, for some time. Holmes sat very still for a moment, looking at the closed door. Then he turned to Miss Marple with an expression that Watson had seen perhaps twice in all their years together. The expression of a man who has encountered something that has moved him, quietly and without fanfare, in a way he had not entirely anticipated. "Miss Marple," he said, "the thing you said to him, about the capacity for feeling." "Yes," she said. "Did you mean it?" She considered this with genuine seriousness. "I meant every word of it," she said. "Whether it helped him or not, I cannot say. But I have found, over a long life, that the truest thing one can offer a person, even a person who has behaved very badly, is to see them accurately, not partially, not conveniently." She smoothed her gloves in her lap. "He will not change. I'm not naive about that. But he heard something this morning that he's perhaps not heard before. That is not nothing." Holmes looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "No," he said softly, "it is not nothing." The fire burned on. The rain continued its patient, faithful attendance at the windows. And Watson, in the warm amber quiet of 221B, reached for his notebook. Not immediately, but after a moment, after he had let the morning settle into its proper shape, and began carefully to write it down. Miss Marple went to Clara that same afternoon. Watson did not go with her. This was correct, and they both knew it. Clara was a young woman who had just received, or was about to receive, a letter ending her engagement, and what she needed in the hours that followed was not a doctor or a detective's associate, but the particular presence of someone who had known her since childhood and loved her without condition. Miss Marple took a cab to Kensington with her small bag and her good coat and her expression of quiet, purposeful tenderness. And Watson watched the cab go from the window of 221B and felt, as he sometimes did at the conclusions of cases, the particular mixture of relief and residual weight that comes from having done what was necessary, and knowing that necessary and painless are rarely the same thing. Holmes was at his desk. He had been at his desk since Doyle left, working through the documentation of the case with the methodical thoroughness he brought to all conclusions, not from bureaucratic habit, but from the conviction, which Watson shared, that things done properly were worth the additional effort of doing properly. He wrote in his small, precise hand. He cross-referenced. He sealed 2 envelopes. One, Watson knew, to his contact in the Bristol Constabulary, flagging certain details for their continued attention without making accusations the current evidence could not support. The other he did not explain, and Watson did not ask. There was a third document, which Holmes did not seal, but left open on the corner of the desk. Watson saw it as he passed. It was a single page, and at the top, in Holmes's hand, were 2 words, Miss Marple. Below them, a series of observations, not a case summary, nothing so formal. More like notes made for personal reference, the kind Holmes occasionally wrote when something had altered his thinking in a way he wanted to record. Watson did not read them, but he saw, in the margin beside one paragraph, a small notation that Holmes had underlined twice. Pattern before proof. He thought that was probably the most concise thing Holmes would ever say about what Miss Marple had given him, and that it was, in its economy, entirely accurate. Clara's letter arrived at the Kensington flat at 2:30. Miss Marple was already there when it came. She had timed her arrival with the instinct of someone who understood that presence matters most in the moments immediately before and immediately after a blow, not only during it. The letter was, by all accounts, kind. Doyle had written that the fault was entirely his own, that he had come to understand he was not in a position to offer Clara the life she deserved, that he released her from the engagement with profound respect and genuine regret, and that he hoped she would, in time, think of him without too much pain. He had enclosed the ring. Clara cried. Of course she did. She had been engaged to a man she believed she loved, and the engagement was over. And the fact that the man was not who she had believed him to be did not immediately diminish the grief of losing who she had believed him to be. These 2 things, the relief of a danger averted and the genuine sadness of a loss sustained, were not contradictory, Miss Marple knew, and she did not attempt to resolve them into a single, tidier feeling. She sat with Clara and let both things be true simultaneously, which is, in the end, the most honest form of comfort available. She told Clara, carefully, that Mr. Doyle hadn't been entirely truthful with her about certain aspects of his history, and that it was better to have discovered this now. She did not tell Clara about the ring. She did not tell Clara about Wiltshire or Devonshire or Bristol. She told her enough to understand that she had been deceived, and not so much that the understanding became a wound larger than the original one. Clara asked, once, whether she should have seen it. Miss Marple said with complete honesty that very clever and very attentive people had looked at this particular man and been deceived, and that there was no failure of perception in Clara, only the ordinary human difficulty of seeing clearly someone one has decided to love. Clara considered this for a moment. Then she said, with the slight wryness of someone finding, through grief, their own small vein of dry humour, I suppose, Aunt Jane, if anyone were going to see it, it would be you. Miss Marple smiled at that, a real smile, warm and a little tired and entirely fond. I have had a great deal of practice, she said. She returned to Baker Street at 5. The afternoon had gone entirely dark by then. The early October night settled firmly over the city, and 221B received her with its usual amber warmth. The lamps lit, the fire well attended, the smell of coal smoke and old books, and the faint ghost of tobacco that had, over years, become simply part of the air of the place. Watson was in his chair. Holmes had moved from his desk to his own chair and sat with his pipe and his stillness, and the room had the quality it sometimes had in the evenings, after something significant had concluded. A quietness that wasn't emptiness, but fullness. The quiet of a space in which something had happened, and the happening had settled. Mrs. Hudson brought tea without being asked, which was her way of acknowledging that the day had been long and left the good biscuits, and withdrew with the tact that was, Watson had long believed, her most undervalued quality. "Clara?" Watson asked. "Sad," Miss Marple said, accepting her cup and settling into the chair that had, over the course of the week, become simply hers. The good chair by the fire, the one Holmes offered without ceremony now, as though it had always been her place when she was here. Sad, and I think, beneath the sadness, beginning to be, not relieved exactly. Something quieter than relief. The feeling of a weight one did not fully know one was carrying beginning to lift. She paused. She is resilient. She will be all right. "The ring?" Holmes asked. "I left it with her. It is hers to do with, as she chooses. Whatever its history, she received it in good faith, and she needn't feel it is contaminated." Miss Marple looked at Holmes steadily. "I told her it was a very fine piece, and worth having assessed properly." Holmes's expression held the suggestion, faint, but legible, of approval. They sat for a moment in the firelight. Watson poured. The rain at the windows was soft and consistent, the sound of it woven into the room so thoroughly that its absence would have seemed strange. Outside, London moved in its evening rhythms, the distant sound of traffic, a voice briefly raised and then quieted, the clop of a horse somewhere in the next street, ordinary and continuous, and, in its way, deeply calming. "There is something," Watson said, "that I have been wanting to ask, about Hartley." Holmes looked at him. "You said the matter was not closed in your mind, and you wrote to Bristol." Watson paused. "Do you believe, I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that a man died in Bristol who knew too much, at a moment when his knowing it had become inconvenient to someone with sufficient coldness to act on that inconvenience. I believe this with reasonable confidence." A pause. "I cannot prove it. The Bristol constabulary are aware of certain details that may, in time, lead somewhere, or may not." He looked at the fire. "There are cases, Watson, where the truth is visible and justice is not available, where the best one can do is ensure that the pattern is documented, that the people most at risk are removed from harm, and that the man responsible understands, as I believe Doyle now understands, that he is seen." "Is that enough?" Watson asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. "It is what is available," he said. "I have learned, over many years, to distinguish between those two things." Miss Marple had been listening to this with the expression she had worn throughout the case, attentive, warm, clear-eyed, carrying her own private assessment of everything she heard without imposing it on the room. Now she said, softly, "Hartley said it wasn't supposed to go this far. I have thought about that sentence a great deal." A pause. "He was not, I think, a good man. But he was not, I don't believe he was, a man who intended what it went to. There is a difference, and it is worth noting, even when it changes nothing practically." Watson thought of the room on the first floor of the boarding house, the railway timetable, the pocket guide to Bristol, the 2 envelopes on the hall table for 3 weeks, waiting, going nowhere, the hands that were not quite steady. "Yes," he said, "it is worth noting." The fire burned, the clock counted. Mrs. Hudson's voice was heard very briefly somewhere below, in conversation with someone Watson could not identify, and then the house settled back into its evening quiet. Miss Marple left at 6:30. Holmes stood when she rose, a courtesy he extended without apparent thought, which Watson noted and appreciated on her behalf. He helped her with her coat. He retrieved her umbrella from the stand by the door. He performed these small attentions with the naturalness of someone who has reconsidered, over the past week, the way he thinks about certain things, and whose behaviour has quietly adjusted to reflect that reconsideration without making any announcement of it. At the door, Miss Marple paused, not from hesitation, but from the same deliberate quality she brought to everything, the sense of choosing her words because they were worth choosing. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "thank you for taking it seriously, from the beginning, or very nearly the beginning." "The nearly?" Holmes said, and there was in his voice something Watson had rarely heard there, a warmth that was neither performed nor managed, but simply present, the warmth of a man who has been genuinely surprised by another person, and is, in his particular way, grateful for it. "The nearly is mine to carry." Miss Marple smiled at that, the full smile, the one that reached entirely to her eyes. "We are none of us," she said, "at our sharpest in the first 5 minutes." She looked at him steadily. "But you listened. That is what matters, in the end. Not the speed of the listening, the quality of it." Holmes held her gaze for a moment. "If you ever find yourself in London again," he said, "with another concern, however small, however apparently trivial, however rooted in the behaviour of people in a very small village, I hope you will come back to Baker Street." "I shall," she said. And then, with the slight, precise warmth of someone delivering the sentence they have been saving, "And you, Mr. Holmes, should visit St. Mary Mead some time. The scale is smaller than London, but the human nature is identical." Holmes considered this. "I may," he said, "take you up on that." Watson walked her down to the street himself, as he had the first evening. The night was cold and clear now. The rain finally paused, the gas lamps along Baker Street burning with a clean, steady light that touched the wet pavements and the bare branches of the plane trees and turned the ordinary street into something that was, for a moment, genuinely beautiful. He held her. "Be all right, won't she?" Watson said. "Not be all right, won't she?" Watson said. Not entirely a question. "Clara." Miss Marple looked at him with those clear, kind eyes. "Yes, she is young, and she is sensible, and she has people who love her." A pause. "The ones who are not all right are the ones who have no one to sit with them afterward. Clara has people." Watson thought about that. "And you, Miss Marple, after a week like this one?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was warm and slightly amused, and, beneath both, something quieter. The expression of someone who has carried difficult things for a long time and has made a kind of peace with the carrying. "I have my garden," she said, "and my village, and my knitting, which I find extremely restorative." A small pause. "And the knowledge that it came out as well as it could. That is, I find, generally sufficient." She stepped up into the cab with his hand for assistance, settled herself, turned once to look back at him through the window with a small, final nod that was its own complete sentence. The cab moved off down Baker Street. Watson watched it go, the lamplight running along its sides, the horse's breath rising in small clouds, the whole thing receding steadily into the amber dark of the London night, until it turned at the corner and was gone. He stood on the step for a moment, in the cold, clear air, looking at the empty street. Then he went back upstairs. Holmes was at the window when Watson came in, looking out at the street below with the particular quality of stillness that meant the case had closed in his mind. Not forgotten, never that, but placed. Filed carefully in the part of him that kept such things, organized and accessible, neither dwelt upon nor discarded. Watson sat down. He opened his notebook to the pages he had been filling through the week. The careful account of Miss Marple's arrival, the boarding-house, the interviews, the morning that had ended with a door closing and a man walking back out into the city, diminished in the only way that mattered. He wrote for a while in the firelit quiet. Holmes did not speak. The clock ticked. The fire breathed. At the top of the first page, Watson wrote 4 words, in the small, careful notation he used for cases that were not for publication. Not for publication, J.W. Then he wrote, beneath it, in slightly larger letters, Miss Marple at Baker Street. October 1935. He looked at it for a moment. Then he added, below the title, a single line. Not a summary, not an explanation, just the thing he most wanted to remember about the week. The thing that seemed to him the truest distillation of what had happened in these rooms and in that boarding-house, and in a quiet flat in Kensington where a young woman was beginning, slowly, to be all right. She saw the whole pattern from the first evening. She had simply been waiting for someone to look. He closed the notebook. Outside, Baker Street was quiet and lamplit and wet with recent rain, and London breathed around it in its vast, indifferent, endlessly human way. And the fire in the grate settled with a small, warm sound, and Holmes turned at last from the window and reached for his pipe, and the night folded itself gently around 221B, as it always did, as it always would.